Adrian Bennett stood motionless among the sea of black-clad mourners, gripping the thin-creased program they handed him at the church doors. Dim light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across his silver-streaked hair, a kaleidoscope of years that could never be reclaimed. The mingled scent of burning candles and old wood turned his stomach, but Adrian didn't move. He only listened to the furious pounding of his own heart. Today wasn't just his father's funeral. It was a burial for every part of himself he'd been forced to abandon along the way. Adrian's childhood wasn't filled with lazy summer afternoons or carefree family outings. He had once dreamed of becoming a writer, crafting vibrant worlds with a blunt pencil and a battered notebook. But inside his home, ruled by the stern discipline of a veteran father, those softer dreams were quickly crushed. Every time Adrian spoke of writing, his father would shake his head, his voice cutting and cold. Real men don't waste time with fairy tales. Adrian learned early to tuck his notebooks away behind math worksheets as if his imagination were a shameful secret. Year after year, Adrian surrendered more of himself. He enrolled in the engineering school his father chose, even as every fiber of his being yearned for the literature department across the quad. He graduated with a degree he never wanted, took a job erecting steel and concrete, while his mind remained anchored somewhere else. Every family dinner was a lesson in endurance, enduring his father's stories of wars and victories, absorbing lectures about strength and masculinity, swallowing every word he wished he could say. At 27, Adrian married a woman his family approved of. The wedding was a parade of forced smiles and polite toasts. For the first time in years, he saw pride flicker in his father's eyes, and Adrian clung to it like a drowning man clutching driftwood. He convinced himself that this hollow life could be enough, that if he tried hard enough, buried deep enough, the silence inside him would eventually be filled. He boxed up his old short stories, buried his youthful crush on a college friend so deeply he nearly forgot it had ever existed, and learned to live half a life. Today, standing before his father's closed casket, Adrian no longer knew whether he was mourning a parent or grieving the final death of any chance for reconciliation. He had followed the blueprint laid before him, sacrificed his dreams, muted his true self, all for a kind of love that now lay cold and unreachable in the ground. The bell tower above rang out its somber call, breaking the heavy silence. The congregation began filing out, their soft murmurs and footsteps fading into the distance. Adrian remained frozen, the world seeming to move on without him. A stern-faced lawyer approached, offering a slight nod and informing him of a private reading of the will, scheduled for that afternoon. Adrian nodded stiffly, feeling nothing. He expected nothing. Every affirmation he had ever craved from his father had already been buried long before the funeral began. What Adrian didn't yet know was that by evening he would be holding a battered envelope in his hands, a message from a man who had never found the courage to speak while living, a message that wouldn't restore the years he had lost, but might offer him something even more precious, the permission at long last to be free. If you've ever felt you had to become someone else just to be loved, stay with HeartStories. Adrian's journey has only begun, and the most important part is still to come. The clock in the lawyer's office ticked louder than it should have, each click snapping against Adrian's frayed nerves like an invisible whip. Afternoon sunlight slanted across the heavy oak table, illuminating the stack of legal papers that looked more like debris from a collapsed world than the orderly closure of a life. Around him sat cousins and distant relatives, their polite masks stretched thin over greedy anticipation. They weren't here to mourn. They were here for what was left. Adrian sat apart as he had always done, feeling like a guest at a party he never wanted to attend. The lawyer, a gaunt man with a dry voice, shuffled the documents and began reading for will bequests rolled out like a tired procession, a fishing cabin to an uncle, savings bonds to a niece, the old Ford pickup. To a brother, Adrian barely heard the words. He stared at the golden letter opener glinting on the table, wondering how many dreams it would take to weigh as much as an inheritance. When his name was finally spoken, Adrian braced himself. He wasn't hoping for money. He wasn't hoping for land. A small, impossible part of him was still hoping for something far rarer, a sign he had mattered in the end. Acknowledgement, a final thread tying him back to the man he had spent a lifetime chasing. Instead, the lawyer cleared his throat and announced, "To Adrian Bennett, my eldest son, I leave the contents of a wooden box stored in my personal study, along with its key." He slid a small brass key across the table. No house, no shares, no land. Just a box. The room shifted with poorly hidden smirks and sidelong glances. Adrian picked up the key, feeling the heat of humiliation creep into his collar. It was a public dismissal disguised as a bequest, and everyone knew it. He left before the final signatures were collected, walking alone across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The sun was too bright, the air too hot, as if the world had moved on, while he remained trapped in an endless, silent winter. He drove to his childhood home without really seeing the road, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The house stood waiting, unchanged and ghostly. Adrian entered with the familiarity of muscle memory, not emotion. The study was just as he remembered, leather-bound books lining the shelves, medals from wars fought long ago, gathering dust, the air heavy with things never said. In the corner, tucked under a window, sat a plain, battered wooden box. He unlocked it with a small brass key. The hinges groaned in protest, as if reluctant to reveal what had been hidden for so long. Inside lay a stack of yellowed notebooks in a sealed envelope bearing his name in the rigid, blocky handwriting he had once tried so hard to imitate. Adrian's breath caught. He pulled out the notebooks first. They weren't filled with his father's financial records or war stories. They were his own. His childhood stories, the ones he thought had been thrown away, the ones he had written secretly under the covers at night, illuminated only by a dying flashlight. Page after page of cramped, messy handwriting greeted him like lost children. Knights and dragons, astronauts and explorers, lonely boys building secret worlds because the real one didn't fit them. Adrian's fingers trembled as he realized his father had kept them all. Every silly, childish tale, every dream. He picked up the envelope last, his chest tightening until it felt like he might never draw another full breath. Peeling it open with shaking fingers, he unfolded the letter inside. It was brief. His father had never been a man of many words, but every line burned through him like wildfire. Son, when you were a boy, I saw the light in you, and I was afraid I thought the world would crush it. So I tried to harden you instead. I thought I was saving you. I see now I was only making you smaller. I kept your stories because they were pieces of the boy. I was too blind to protect. I am sorry I was wrong. If there's still time, write again. Not for me, for you, Dad. The paper blurred as Adrian pressed it against his chest. For years, he had built walls inside himself, thinking it would protect him from the shame of failing his father's expectations. Now he saw the tragedy was not that he had failed, but that he had succeeded too well. He sank into the old armchair by the window, the letter still clutched in his hand. The house around him was silent except for the slow creak of wood settling in the afternoon heat. For the first time, Adrian allowed himself to grieve, not just for his father, but for the boy who had wanted nothing more than to be seen. Outside, the world hummed with a life he had long kept at bay, a life he might still claim if he dared to begin again. The letter lay heavy against Adrian's heart, as if its words had stitched themselves into the frayed seams of his soul. He sat in his father's study long after the sun had dropped behind the hills, long after the world outside had surrendered to darkness. The house around him felt like a museum of ghosts. Every photograph, every cracked leather chair, every muted memory, a testament to lives shaped by duty, not dreams. The realization gnawed at him with a slow, unrelenting ache. He had spent 4 decades living a life that wasn't truly his. He had built a respectable career, maintained a marriage, attended family functions, celebrated holidays, all with a hollow smile, masking a hollow man. It hadn't been survival. It had been slow, willing extinction. Adrian left the study only when the walls felt too close, the silence too accusing. He wandered through the empty house, trailing his fingers along dusty banisters, half expecting his father's booming voice to call him back, to correct his posture, to remind him who he was supposed to be. But there was only silence, and in that silence, a question he could no longer outrun. If I am not the man he shaped me into, then who am I really? In the guest bedroom where he used to sleep as a boy, he found a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. He stood before it, studying the lines time had etched into his face. The tired eyes, the resigned mouth, the posture of a man who had learned too early to fold himself small. For a long moment, Adrian did nothing. Then, almost without thinking, he pulled his phone from his pocket, opened the camera, and snapped a single photo. Not to share, not to perform, simply to witness himself. He slept fitfully on the narrow bed that night, the letter tucked under his pillow like a fragile promise. In his dreams, he was running through endless hallways, each door marked with things he had lost. Youth, joy, love. No matter how fast he ran, the walls kept closing in. He woke before dawn, the sky outside still smeared with bruised purple and gray. Something had shifted in him overnight. The grief remained, a raw, untended wound. But underneath it, something else stirred, a pulse of defiance, a stubborn ember he thought had been extinguished long ago. He realized with startling clarity his father's apology, though late, was an invitation, a key he could either accept or leave rusting in the past. Adrian packed only what he could fit into a single duffel bag. He left the house without saying goodbye to anyone. He wasn't running away. He was stepping out of a life that no longer fit, out of a costume he had worn for so long. He had forgotten the shape of his own skin. Back at his small apartment on the edge of town, the space felt foreign, like stepping into a stranger's life. The framed diplomas, the wedding photos, the neatly organized bookshelf full of technical manuals, all artifacts of a version of himself built for survival, not for living. Adrian pulled the frames from the walls. He packed the diplomas into boxes, stacked the books in neat piles for donation. His wedding ring, long since removed but never discarded, he slipped into an envelope and mailed to his ex-wife with a simple note. "Thank you for your kindness when I could not offer my truth." The hardest part was not the letting go. It was facing the empty space that remained. He had no roadmap for this, no checklist, no guarantees. Sitting at his bare kitchen table, Adrian opened one of the old notebooks from the pile. The pages smelled faintly of dust and lost time. His childish scrawl danced across the lines, telling stories of knights who saved themselves, of travelers who found home not in places but in choosing to believe they deserved one. Without allowing himself to overthink it, Adrian grabbed a pen. The first words came awkwardly, like a stuttering engine, but then slowly they began to flow. Not perfect, not polished, but alive. Stories poured from him, some joyful, some aching, all utterly unmistakably his. Hours passed unnoticed. The sky shifted from gray to gold to indigo. When he finally looked up, his fingers ached. His heart beat faster and his soul felt just a little less caged. He wasn't whole yet. He wasn't healed, but for the first time, Adrian wasn't writing to prove anything to anyone. Not to his father, not to a world that demanded masks and armor. He was writing because the boy inside him had never stopped hoping someone would listen. And now at last, Adrian was listening. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like the first tentative notes of a long-forgotten song. Adrian Bennett was not a man who leapt into change with reckless abandon. His nature had been shaped by caution, by fear, by years of obeying rules written by other hands. But now every small step felt revolutionary. He started with what he had always feared most, the empty spaces. He cleared out his apartment until it resembled a canvas more than a living space. Gone were the tokens of a life built for approval. In their place, Adrian hung a single framed page, the first story he had ever written as a boy, a tale of a lonely knight who chose to guard a lighthouse rather than conquer kingdoms. He didn't know exactly what future he was building toward, but he knew it had to be real. It was during a restless night, sprawled across his living room floor, surrounded by piles of his old notebooks, that the idea first came to him. A place for stories and people who needed them. A place for the quiet ones, the dreamers, the ones who had been told their voices were too strange, too soft, too much. A bookstore, the idea felt reckless, almost foolish, but it also felt like breathing. Adrian spent hours sketching plans on the back of napkins and scrap paper. He scouted empty storefronts in the quieter parts of town where foot traffic was scarce, but hope lingered stubbornly in cracked sidewalks and faded murals. When he found a small, neglected corner shop with dusty windows and a crooked front door, he didn't hesitate. He signed the lease with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from something dangerously close to exhilaration. He named it the Yellow Lantern, after a story he had written as a boy about a lighthouse that refused to go dark, even when the sea tried to swallow it. Restoring the space became its own kind of therapy. Adrian tore up rotting floorboards, scrubbed years of grime from the windows' repainted walls in warm, inviting colors. He lined the shelves with secondhand books, the kind that smelled of ink and dust and endless possibility. At the back, he set up a small reading nook furnished with worn armchairs and soft lighting where visitors could lose themselves in worlds far kinder than the one outside. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't grand, but it was his. When the Yellow Lantern opened its doors for the first time, only a handful of people wandered in. Curious neighbors, a retired schoolteacher, a teenager clutching a notebook to her chest like a shield. Adrian greeted each one with quiet gratitude, offering not just books, but a place where no one had to apologize for what made them different. Slowly, word spread. Artists, writers, musicians, and those who had simply spent too long pretending to be something they weren't began to find their way there. Adrian organized open mic nights, writing workshops, storytelling circles. He stood awkwardly at first, unused to speaking in front of the strangers, but the more he listened to their stories, their laughter, their small acts of bravery, the more he realized he was building something larger than a bookstore. He was building a home for voices like his own. One evening after closing up, Adrian lingered at the front window, watching the last of the sunset bleed into the city skyline. A sense of peace settled over him. Not the brittle, tentative peace he had once tried to manufacture, but something deeper rooted in the knowledge that he was no longer hiding. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the figure standing just beyond the streetlight's glow. A man slightly older now, but unmistakable, holding something small in his hand. Adrian's breath caught as recognition flooded through him. It was Ethan, the boy he had loved in secret during college. The boy whose name he had never dared to speak aloud, even in the privacy of his own mind. Ethan stepped forward, still holding the small object, a single violet flower trembling slightly in the evening breeze. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. In that moment, all the lost years, all the unspoken words, all the miles Adrian had traveled away from himself, collapsed into a single silent truth. It was never too late to find your way home. Adrian Bennett stood by the door of the Yellow Lantern, the soft hum of conversation and laughter filling the small space behind him. The evening had stretched long after the official closing time, but no one seemed eager to leave. Adrian didn't mind. This was the life he had longed for without even knowing it, the kind built not on expectation but on belonging. The flower Ethan had given him sat in a small glass of water on the counter. Violet, a color he once feared to wear, now resting boldly in the heart of his shop. They hadn't spoken much that night. Words weren't needed. A simple look had been enough to say, "I see you, but I still do." In the weeks that followed, Ethan became a regular presence at the Yellow Lantern. Some evenings they sat side by side in the reading nook, sharing worn books and quiet smiles. Other nights, Ethan helped Adrian organize community events, their easy companionship blossoming into something that felt achingly new and achingly right. But it wasn't just Ethan, and it wasn't just love. It was Adrian himself, stepping into his life, owning his voice, refusing to shrink back into a shape that pleased others, but silenced his heart. The bookstore grew slowly, fueled not by profit, but by spirit. Adrian started a monthly gathering called The First Word, an open space for anyone who needed to speak aloud something they had buried too long. Some nights were filled with poetry, others with stories of survival, and sometimes just simple declarations like, "I exist and that's enough." On the anniversary of the shop's opening, Adrian hosted a small celebration. The walls were decorated with handwritten notes from visitors, dreams they dared to say out loud, stories they had kept hidden until now. As Adrian stood at the front looking out over the sea of faces lit with soft, hopeful light, he realized something breathtaking. He had not just saved a part of himself, he had built a lighthouse for others too. In the quiet that followed the night's final reading, Adrian pulled out the old letter from his father, now worn at the edges from being read and reread. He didn't need it to survive anymore, but he kept it, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Healing is messy, incomplete, and utterly beautiful later. As he locked up the shop and stepped into the cool night air, Adrian looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. He thought about all the years he had spent chasing love that had conditions, all the years he believed he had to earn the right to be seen. And yet, here he was, not because he had earned it, but because he had finally claimed it. He was not perfect, he was not invincible, but he was at last real. Have you ever felt like the hardest person to forgive is yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear your story. Stay with Heart Stories for more journeys of healing, courage, and the kind of love that never asks you to be anyone but yourself.